Well, good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion, the second event in our Putney Debates of 2023. Just in case you weren't present at the previous lecture, I'll introduce myself again. I'm Denis Galligan, Professor Emeritus of Oxford University Law Faculty and Director of the Oxford Global Society. We're now assembled to hear a discussion amongst four panelists of the idea of leadership and democracy, how these ideas fit together or don't fit together, and the various interesting issues that arise. Each of the panelists will speak for up to 10 minutes, not more. When we do the Putney Debates in St. Mary's Church, we have traffic lights. And at 8 minutes, the light turns orange, and at 10 minutes, it turns red. And it's very hard to speak against a red light. So unfortunately, we can't implement that system here. I'm relying on your conscientious compliance with the time limits. Let me introduce our panelists. So first of all, we have Fui Tsikata. Fui is a senior lawyer from Ghana, formerly teaching in the University of Ghana. Then we have Iris Canor. Iris is assistant professor at Strike's School of Law. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Iris, at Colman, Israel. Then we have Vlad Perju, professor at Boston College School of Law. And finally, we have Bogdan Iancu, associate professor at Bucharest University. Each comes with a very interesting and distinguished record in these matters we're about to discuss. Now, once they have presented their 10 minutes, there will be some debate amongst the panelists, and then we'll open it up to hear comments and questions from the audience. We plan to finish in about an hour to an hour and a quarter, so depending how it goes, but certainly not beyond an hour and a quarter. Well, on that score, I'm just going to make a few brief comments to introduce the subject following on the preceding lecture. So what's before us here is the figure of the leader. If you were to read the daily headlines or listen to the BBC News, you would be led to think the power of government were vested in one person. Not only autocrats of dubious credentials, but prime ministers and presidents, duly elected, seem to decide matters of high policy and utmost importance. Whether a trade agreement with the EU, independence for Scotland, international issue of climate change, the prime minister is presented not just as the leader of government, but as the government. The leader is superior to all other officials and agencies and gains control of the political party. Most of all, the leader cultivates a special relationship with the people. So when she waves her handbag in Brussels, the people cheer. You know who I'm referring to, I'm sure. When he or she takes a hard line in international affairs, promises to sort out illegal immigration, attacks the opposition as self-serving and soft-headed, ratings rise. When he or she promises to look after the sector's most loyal, to give them jobs and improve their lot, ratings soar. The combination of the two factors, domination over the political arena and a special relationship with the people, are the marks of contemporary democracies, sometimes called plebiscitary or plebiscitary democracy. What's the base of this? What's the social base? Power is the key commodity at the base of plebiscitary democracy. The struggle for power is the priority. Acquiring and holding onto power becomes an end in itself. Concern for the results of power, that is, good government, are of lesser importance, almost incidentally. The primary relationship then, within the constitutional order, becomes that between leader and people. The consequences are several. A leader's priority is to stay in power. The best means to cultivate the people to that end. Secondly, the people breaks down into the loyal and the rest, something Richard spoke about in his previous lecture. Thirdly, this has the effect of bypassing the other institutions of government and the constitutional constraints, or at least weakening them. In the face of the relationship between the leader and the people, those institutions and constraints turn out to be rather weak. Looked at from the point of view of the people as a whole, the people who view the power of government as an instrument to serve their needs and utilities, their well-being, if you like, the issue is how to contain and control the power of leadership. How to link this to democracy. Democracy means the demos, the people, in some sense, ruling themselves. The plebiscitary democracy implicit in the people-leader relationship is one version of democracy. The more usual version, though, is to drop the claim of the people ruling themselves and settle for rule by representatives. And we've just had a very, very impressive lecture on rule by representatives. Representatives stand in for, represent, in some sense, the interests of the people, on some accounts actually embody the people. The question then is how representative democracy copes with the problem of leadership. I suggest an alternative more promising, you may not agree, is to drop the pretense of representation, confront the issue of how the people can exercise supervision over leaders and agencies and find practical processes for doing so. On that note, I therefore turn to Fui Tsikata. Fui, over to you, and remember the red light.
Thank you, Denis. I would like to organize my discussion around 5 thematic points, or sets of points, really. First set of points, democracy as rhetoric versus democracy as substantive performance. Second set of points, leadership, political power, and transformative projects. Thirdly, the transcending role of the political party. Fourthly, how independent are the supposedly independent constitutional bodies? And finally, assessing leadership and democratic practice. So let me begin with the first. In a recent article entitled Nigeria's Hollow Democracy, the writer Chimamanda Adichie refers to an editorial in the Washington Post which opines that much good came from the Nigerian elections, which are worth celebrating because, among other things, no one has blocked highways as happened in Brazil after Jair Bolsonaro lost his re-election bid. She goes on to say, we are also told that it is encouraging that losing candidates are pursuing their claims through the courts. Chimamanda describes the reactions of the Washington Post and the US State Department as those of quote unquote cordial condescension. Has the United States, she's asked, once again decided that what matters in Africa is not democracy, but stability? Or is it about that ever effulgent nemesis China, as so much of US foreign policy now invariably seems to be, end quote. What her comments point to are both the elasticity of measures of democratic advance and the potential for using the label as merely an indicator of approval or disapproval, rather than of genuine assessment of substantive performance. This also connects with the phenomenon of leaders more committed to the rhetoric of democracy as performance, than to the actualization of democratic practice. My next set of observations, as I said, relates to a theme that we might formulate as leadership, political power, and transformative projects. In no ordinary time, the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin gives us an instructive and fascinating account of the skills, energy, and passion that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt deployed in the transformation of what FDR described as a significantly ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished country into a nation in which substantial progress had been made in quality of life, social mobility, and economic revitalization. The underlying premise was, of course, that indicia of material welfare of the majority of the population were as much a part of the democratic project as were institutional governmental arrangements reflective of staple constitutional doctrines, and that active governmental intervention was not by itself inconsistent with democracy. It does not take much imagination to transpose the challenges that the Roosevelts confronted with those faced by leaders of anti-colonial movements when they took over the institutions of government upon independence. Yearnings and projects for social change were evidently central to anti-colonial movements. However, certain differences in context must be noted. In the first place, the constitutions under which those leaders got into office typically stood historical practice on its head. Liberal constitutions reflecting different aspirations from the authoritarianism of immediately preceding governmental practice. Secondly, some of these constitutions contained strong provisions aimed at protecting advantages procured by ruling groups who were becoming minorities in the transition to government elected through one person, one vote process. Thirdly, the starting point of the Roosevelt's dominant constituencies, and indeed of the levelers' demands in 1647, was for greater inclusion in the polity. The central demand of the anti-colonial struggle was not for the rulers to bring us into their rule. If anything, in many instances, the demand was for them to leave and leave us alone. In sum, the context in which the Roosevelts mobilized support and sought to obstruct, marginalize, or co-opt representatives of vested interests opposed to their projects for change was rather different from that of those who led popular nationalist movements into government in much of Africa and, I dare say, the rest of the developing world. The risks to the latter projects for change ranged from regime destabilization by external and internal forces through to a descent into authoritarian, demagogic, and essentially parasitic rule. I will make my next set of observations under the theme, the transcending role of the political party. The mass-based political party has been an important vehicle for mobilizing for independence and has remained significant in contests for political power. Constitutional doctrines of separation of powers and checks and balances have to reckon with the capacity of the party machine to override or modify their operation by uniting, often in subterranean activity, though at other times openly, power structures whose separation or combination those doctrines express themselves as prescribing or constraining. The avenues for access to power that they provide means that the political party can be a vehicle for mobilizing for social change or primarily for individual or factional self-advancement. Indeed, the expression state capture has gained popularity as shorthand for the corrosion of public purpose and its replacement by decision-making in the interests of a narrow band of business people who manage to exercise overwhelming influence over the executive and other public sector institutions. Attempts to constrain the combination of power in an elected executive and legislature belonging to the same political party have at least heightened the desire for independent institutions not beholden to either. In the traditional doctrines of constitutional democracy, the independence of the judiciary has been a central tenet to that end. The Constitution of Ghana, for example, grandly proclaims in Article 125, Clause 1 that, quote, justice emanates from the people and shall be administered in the name of the Republic by the judiciary, which shall be independent and subject only to this Constitution, end of quote. In several constitutions, other institutions, such as the Electoral Commission, have been designed with that aim in view. the fundamental assessment to make is how independent are those who populate those bodies in their performance? What commitment to respect their capacity for independence is shown by other organs of governmental power? How much does it matter to other elements of society that those who are supposed to be independent actually act independent? My final point is a brief and you might say somewhat obvious one. Setting out criteria for eligibility for election or appointment to high office is relatively easy and often expressed in constitutional provisions: citizenship, residence, age, absence of criminal conviction, etc. It is hard enough, on the other hand, to articulate and formulate criteria for assessing leadership capabilities in the concrete context. It is even harder to apply them with any degree of confidence in the evaluation of candidates for political office. It is simply impossible to formulate justiciable criteria, that is, such as can be enforced in the context of legal proceedings. That may perhaps be an implicit call to modesty, a reminder to those of us whose professional preoccupations focus on the constitutional text and the principal doctrines that undergird them, of how much more there is to assessing democracy in any given context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fui. That was a very stimulating and slightly provocative way of starting. Thank you very much. Well, we go immediately to our next panelist, and that is, if I remember rightly, that's going to be you, Vlad.
So thank you. I would like to thank you first for the opportunity to be part of this panel and of this debate. Questions about leadership, democracy, and the relation between them reach deep into political and constitutional thought. It is instructive to hear thinkers analyze and debate these issues, instructive for understanding how ideas are framed, what defenders of particular positions feel compelled to specify, and what they believe goes without saying, instructive also, and importantly, for understanding the fears, hopes, and ambitions in relation to the project of collective self-rule, of free communities of equals. Already, this particular way of framing the issues grounds one within a particular tradition in political thought that sees freedom and equality as central to political rule, as a matter of aspiration, of what political philosophers sometimes call normative commitment. Such commitment may set this tradition apart, but the grounding of particular arguments in such broader conceptions is common and useful to keep in mind. Many of the concepts we use, freedom, social justice, equality, self-determination, authority, each of these concepts has a long tradition, each encasing particular conceptions of what human emancipation requires as a matter of principle, particular interpretations of history, and relatedly, particular views of what is open, possible, and politically desirable for specific communities at specific moments in time. With these admittedly vague preliminaries in place, let me go into my argument, our theme, democracy in crisis, leadership ? In what follows, I want to isolate and analyze a particular kind of threat, one among many, I should say, to the project of democratic self-rule, a threat that is from the normative perspective I just mentioned. The threat is the alteration of the sovereign, the remaking or remodeling of the particular community to fit the interests of political leadership. The threat, to put it another way, of reversing the directionality of legitimation. What is supposed to be from the sovereign people to the representatives now becomes from the leader to the people. It's not the people who choose the rulers, but the rulers who put themselves in a position to choose the people. While this threat reflects impulses as old as time, the will to entrench oneself into power, its adaptive strategies to our present political moment, a blend of discursive, institutional, and conceptual factors, are new. We should try to identify and understand them. And having identified them, we should ask how constitutional democracies can protect themselves against it. If that task is not easy, we should try to figure out what makes it difficult. What tools are we lacking? What is missing from how we structure the political world? Note that one of the ways we structure that world is through our choices of constitutional design. Taking that perspective helps to grasp the complexity of the matters at hand. Constitutional designers have more to be concerned than proactively strengthening the institutional structure against any one particular threat. There are more threats to protect against, other goals for the system being designed. We expect our constitutional structures to be usable, representative, responsive, empowering, adaptive, and just. And we also need them to be resilient. I will spend much of the time that I have left on the challenge to democracy that I've mentioned, trying to capture it in the vocabulary and with the depth of constitutional theory. In a recent book, John Keane describes, and I now quote, new types of pseudo-democratic governments led by rulers skilled in the arts of manipulating or meddling with people's lives, marshalling their support and winning their conformity. New despotisms are top-down pyramids of power that defy political gravity by nurturing the willing subservience and docility of their subjects. End of quote. Keane goes on to mention voluntary servitude as a feature of these systems, which he calls phantom democracies. He discusses them by reference to political developments in Turkey, United States, Poland, Brazil, Venezuela, Hungary, Vietnam, Turkey, among others. Now, I think it is important to contrast phantom democracies with genuine democracies and to understand what sets apart the former. But I don't think we'll find an answer if by genuine or real democracies we mean perfect democracies. Rather, self-sustaining democracies are, to use Charles Taylor's elegant formulation, telic concepts. They are in the process of becoming. Part of the challenge is that, as we will see, phantom democracies are built with tools rooted in the pathologies of genuine democracies. This adds complexity to the task of understanding this particular phenomena. Now, a persistent question for Keane and others is why phantom democracies still hold elections to select their leaders. To be sure, not all of them do, and these are not entirely fair elections, yet elections that are real enough, elections that can lead to the change of leadership. Think of the recent elections in Brazil, think of coming elections in Poland or Turkey. One reason is, of course, international legitimation of the regime, but Keane also points to the docility and subservience of the electorate. I think there is more, or something else going on here, and for that we need to move to the level of theory. To get to the diagnosis, we should bring into the conversation two additional features of political rule in these phantom democracies. One feature is anti-pluralism. As Jan van der Müller saw a while ago, for these regimes, pluralism is simply not part of the circumstances of politics. I mean pluralism in Rawls's sense of the fact of pluralism, the social fact of human diversity and plurality in a political community that lives under, by and large, free institutions. The central question of politics for that in the liberal democracy is stability for the right reasons, as Rawls says, under conditions of pluralism. The new despots deny pluralism as the horizon against which politics unfolds. They are fact deniers in this sense. The other additional factor is a claim of a direct, unmediated connection between the leader and the people. Under present-day conditions, a shared political identity is critical for understanding that connection. This provides an answer to what is otherwise an unexplainable feature of authority in these political systems. How can plutocrats have popular appeal? It is sometimes said that we live at a time of ocular democracy. That is a time when people's political participation takes the form of watching the powerful. We participate by watching. I watch, therefore I am, as a political subject. But when we watch, how can we recognize ourselves in a Berlusconi or a Trump? Identity provides the medium for such a connection. The supposedly shared identity acts as a bridge that is decisive to the regime's underlying conception of self-government. You might say that the medium is entirely fabricated, and of course it is, but identity lodges itself in the mind, and so in that sense, it is no less real. Now, the fabrication depends on the existence of an unmediated connection between the ruler and the people, Mediation poses great dangers to the project. Therefore, any form of mediation threatens to unsettle that identity because it can undermine the leader's claim to be the authoritative interpreter of the will of the people. It is not surprising that once in power, these leaders seek to weaken the independence of mediating institutions, such as media, NGOs, universities, the judiciary, political parties. And if I had time, but I don't, I would go into a study of how universities and higher education comes under attack. The point is that when these attacks are successful, these institutions become captured. They deploy their specific tools to create a political community that fits the leader's specifications. State-controlled media redefines political reality. Courts engage in discriminatory legalism. That is, as I called it, discrimination as a doctrinal pair of scissors that selectively disempowers or deselects the unwanted elements of the demos. And I think that identitarian constitutionalism underpins some of these developments, and it's quite useful to look at the developments in the United States and to understand them along these lines. Look at religious discrimination, look at the disempowerment of women of their bodily autonomy, look at the persistent failure to recognize the existence of rights to education, healthcare, sanitation, shelter, look at the coming ban on benign racial classifications, the deconstitutionalization of political gerrymandering, so on and so forth. There's similar developments elsewhere in many other constitutional systems. So you can describe this entire process as the creation of a docile people, but at a deeper level, I think, it is an attempt to carve out a new and more reliable sovereign. In this sense, these attempts are anti-pluralistic. The animus is to remake the people, to curate the sovereign, to create a phantom people for a phantom democracy. Yes, these regimes still hold elections, hollowed out elections that are celebratory, in that voters are called to confirm rather than select the leader. Remember Trump's claim that the election must have been rigged if he didn't win it. It reflects the assumption that voter members of the political community proper could only have voted for him. So elections in and I will end with this, elections in these phantom democracies are confirmatory in more than just one way. Not only do they confirm the leader, but they also confirm how far along is the execution of the underlying project of remaking the political community. So I will end with this.
Oh, well, thank you, Vlad. That's a very interesting point to end on. So we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in the discussion. This idea of confirming, yes. So over to you, Bogdan. You have 10 minutes.
I want to share with you intuitions rather than a full argument. Now, and my intuitions complement those that were just spelled out by Vlad about the lack of mediating institutions. It's just that the mediating institutions to which I'm referring are somewhat different than the institutions that he enumerated. Now, and I wanted to start with an anecdote, with a paradox, really. I know that Denis doesn't like the word paradoxes, probably as a result of our... Now, so the perplexity is the following. If you remember, Steve Bannon said at some point that Orban was Trump before Trump, see? And Trump visited with Mr. Orban and took his cues from Orban. Tucker Carlson famously went repeatedly to Budapest, to the as a kind of strange trek to the defensor, the defender of the populist faith, and that's extraordinary. There was nothing to anticipate such a move, namely the leader of the most powerful country in the world, of the oldest continuing democracy, the leader of one of the two American mainstream parties, taking cues, learning lessons from the prime minister of a peripheral country whose GDP is about $100 million, lower than that of Romania, and about 7-8 times smaller than that of Florida. So how come? How is that possible? There was nothing to anticipate such a move in the 1990s, and we are all old enough, not Iris, of course, assistant professor, but we're all old enough here to remember the 90s and the fact that there was nothing in the 90s to anticipate the president of the United States taking lessons from the prime minister of a peripheral, small, relatively poor, post-communist new member of the European Union, such as Hungary. And speaking about Florida, the president of Hungary, who's in the inner circle of Mr. Orban, Katalin Novak, went to Florida partly because Prime Minister Orban wants to hedge his bets. He doesn't know who's going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. Is it going to be Ron DeSantis? Is it going to be Trump? So partly he's hedging his bets. She's in his inner circle, and of course, should have never gotten to be the president of Hungary had she not been in the inner circle of Prime Minister Orban. But so this is partly hedging of bets, but partly it's also endorsement. So the president of Hungary endorses the nominee of the potential nominee of the GOP to the presidency of the United States. Think about how strange that is, no? And why is that? Now, I won't have time to explain all the intricacies of this perplexity, but I will have time to point out one thing that relates to the title of the panel, and that was brought out by Richard during his lecture as well. And indeed, had we been in Putney, we could have seen that on the plaque, on the ceiling beam, the citation from Rainbow. I truly think that Colonel Rainbow was one of the leaders of the Levelers, and he represented the so-called democratic position in Cromwell's army. And he said famously, I truly think, sir, that the poorest he that lives in England has a life to live, as the greatest he. And the response to that was the son-in-law of Cromwell, who represented grandees. And he said, well, no, this is not so. Only those who have a permanent vested interest in the kingdom should have a say about how public affairs are run. Now, and if you look at the classics of liberalism, you see that leadership in constitutionalism has not that much to do with democracy. No, democracy is about equality. Leadership in the constitutional classics is about elite, enlightened, lawful rule. That comes across clearly in, in Federalist 10. I won't go into that because Richard already mentioned it. But if you look at the reactions of the classics of English constitutionalism to the extensions of the franchise in the 19th century, that comes out very clearly. Bagehot, for example. I read yesterday my Princeps edition of Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, the namesake of the eponymous column in The Economist and the first chief editor, if I'm not mistaken, of The Economist. And Bagehot wrote the English Constitution, that's classic of constitutional theory even now, in response to the Reform Act of 1867, in anticipation of it, because he serialized it. And the second edition contains a 70-page introduction about his fears, about the effects of the Reform Act. And he says the following, is extracted with his citation. He says, nothing worse or more corrupting than a set of poor, ignorant people, than that two combinations of well-taught and rich men should constantly offer to defer to their decisions. And then he says, a political combination of the lower classes as such and for their own objects is an evil of the first magnitude. The real question, Bagehot underlines, is will they is of course the newly enfranchised voters as a result of the Reform Act of 1867, will they submit to it? Will they defer in the same way to wealth and rank and to the higher qualities, of which these are the rough symbols and the common accompaniments? No? And of course, he has a long strategy about that, how that could be tamed, the extension of the franchise. And it wasn't much of an extension. No? The Second Reform Act only enlarged the electorate to about 60% of the English adult males. Yet Bagehot considered it a mortal danger to the system as such. Dicey, when he wrote Law and Public Opinion in the 19th century, what he considered to be his true masterpiece. Dicey was very afraid about the advent of democracy, and he had behind him the Reform Act of 1832, 1867, and the Reform Act of 1884 and the Redistribution of Seats Act of 1885. And he says in the additional manuscript of the Macmillan Papers, I have no belief myself that England will in the long run be converted into a socialistic state. The rich and the educated will somehow or another get the upper hand. And of course, Dicey saw in the book as such, the solution to that dilemma, to that problem, to be democracy tempered by snobbishness. No, because he said, well, the Englishmen, even if they have the right to vote, they will defer. No, they have a tradition of deference. They know who their betters are. They will listen to them. They will stay quiet. Now, and the spear is also evoked by Lord Hewart of Bury, the Chief Justice of England, who in 1929, so after the last extension of the franchise, not to women, mind you, yet, wrote The New Despotism. Now, Lord Hewart was writing technically about the administration, but what really irked him was the fledgling administrative state, the extension of democracy. And my point is the following. These two elements, rule by elites and democracy as an aspiration of equality, they were not reconciled by the universal suffrage. By the advent of the universal suffrage. They were reconciled rather by the creation of the mediating institutions that made universal suffrage function, and that only obtained, so when we speak about liberal democracy, we have an idealized vision of how things should go rather well, what would be the optimal outcome, towards what does Hungary in the 1990s, not nowadays, want to transition to,
Okay, sorry to interrupt, you've got 1 minute.
All right, I'll close it in 1 minute. So that these two elements could only be reconciled for a short period of time in a few countries by a welfare state that gave everyone the possibility to imagine, at least the fiction, that they could better themselves, that they could become what they wanted. So as these institutions, these preconditions are eroding in the West, people like Trump and other populists in Western democracies, they take their cues from countries where such preconditions, this reconciliation, never took place. So this is my point.
Thank you, Bogdan. Very interesting point. I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion. And indeed, some of the general historical points you made are most important. But we'll now go to you, Iris, for the fourth presentation, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I hope my internet is stable enough. I'm sitting in the Hebrew University and I rely on their internet. And sometimes I hear you but don't see you moving. I hope it works. So I will take you to the case study, if you want, of Israel. We normally talk about Hungary and Poland, but they are the past. Israel is under this democratic crisis currently. And what you will probably see in the Israeli case many of the thoughts that already were made before. I will show you the leader's role, but also problems of popular democracy and liberal values. It's I think it's important to go into the substance of each case because, as Tolstoy said, all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And it seems to me that we need to know, we talk about Orban in Hungary, we need to understand what is the motivation of the leader as well. So let's go to Israel, because that's where I can talk about more. So just to set the background, the political background, so Israel is a parliamentary democracy with a unicameral parliament, which is called the Knesset, and it's composed by 120 members. But the government controls the parliament. It's really important because the government in Israel is a creation of a coalition. The head of the biggest party is the prime minister, but the coalition, as a matter of fact, controls the parliament. Having said that, Israel elects all other or many other normal or usual checks and balances in other democracies. It does not have an entrenched constitution. It does not have two legislative houses. It does not have a presidential veto. It does not have a federalist structure. It doesn't have regional elections. It is not subordinated to supranational courts. It is not subordinate to a multi-level supranational organization like the EU. So we are left as the matter of fact with three branches in which the government fully controls the parliament. So now let's talk about the leader, the prime minister, which is Bibi Netanyahu. And I think Bibi Netanyahu answers or fixes the concept of a charismatic leader. He is the longest tenured prime minister in Israel, so longer than the Ben-Gurion, which is the famous one, having in total 15 years of leadership in Israel. In his first elections in 1996, when he was still young, he was the first directly elected prime minister in Israel. Then was abolished, afterwards it was abolished, but he was a directly elected prime minister. Beat then Shimon Peres, who was the leader of the Labour Party, and it was just after the assassination of Rabin, and nobody thought that anyone except the Labour Party can win, and still he won the elections. Now, fast forward to the current situation. In 2019, Netanyahu was indicted on charges of breach of trust, bribery, and fraud after a long investigation. Still, the Israeli court said that he can run to and continue to be nominated to be a prime minister in Israel. So since this indictment, for 3 years, we have 5 elections in Israel. So it became a very unstable political situation. And it is, I will explain in a second why this instability came. Just moving to another democratic leader, we normally talk about prime ministers, but still in Israel, the only branch which criticizes the prime minister and the government is the court. So one, again, charismatic leader of the Israeli court from the 80s onwards, but mainly also in the time that Bibi Netanyahu was the prime minister, was our president of the Supreme Court, then the president of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, playing a role also today. And Aaron Barak came to the court in the 80s and changed the court as well, in the sense that it introduced, if you want, 2 revolutions. One of them is the administrative revolution, in which he said that ruled that every administrative act can be reviewed by the court through the lenses of the reasonableness doctrine, allowing everyone to have locus standi to the court, everyone who wants to challenge the legality of an administrative act, abolishing the political question theory, so even administrative acts which has based themselves on political grounds can be examined by the court, and the court is doing this through the lenses of reasonableness. Not only that, shortly afterwards, he introduced another revolution, which was called the Constitutional Revolution in Israel, in which it said that the court can declare also legislation void if it conflicts, since we don't have a constitution, if it conflicts with 2 important basic laws that were legislated in the 90s, mainly the basic law, human dignity and liberty. So it sees to the court the power to control the government or to review the government and to review the parliament. And as a matter of fact, it was the only check that we had in Israel over the government. Now, the government lived with it to a certain extent, but then, as I said, once Bibi Netanyahu was indicted, then it was a political cleavage in Israel, whether Netanyahu can really, although the court said it is allowed, it's not illegal for Netanyahu to become a prime minister or be elected as a prime minister despite these criminal allegations, there was, of course, in the public, there was a question whether Bibi Netanyahu should become our prime minister. And in a way, the political division was that the right-wing parties, most of them said that they will go only with Bibi Netanyahu, and the Likud party his party insisted that he will be the leader, while the center and left party says we cannot create a coalition with the Likud party in which Bibi Netanyahu is the leader. So the whole elections, these 5 elections that I talked about, were about the leader, whether to be with Bibi or without Bibi, but it was about Bibi Netanyahu, not about any other political questions that Israel really confronts. And to come to almost the end of the story as far as the political description is, so in November 2022, Netanyahu led the right-wing bloc and wins the elections in Israel. In December, it forms the coalition, the government, which is the most right-wing in Israeli history. And in January 2023, so 1 month later, the Minister of Justice, nominated by Bibi Netanyahu, started a constitutional reform in Israel. And the aim of this constitutional reform was to achieve almost exclusive power of the government over the only branch that still stands in the way of the government, namely the court.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Iris, 2 minutes to go.
Okay, so the judicial reform that they offer is about controlling the independence of the judges. So apropos what we talked about before, they insist that the government, the populist government, should be able to nominate the judges, and by that, of course, control what the court will, how the court will decide, and that shows you the interest of Bibi Netanyahu. So there are 2 interests. One is the personal interest of Bibi Netanyahu, that by choosing the judges, it will be able somehow to get away from his indictment and his criminal accusations. So that's one part. And the other part is the survival of Bibi Netanyahu as the leader of Israel, because its coalition parties, the right-wing and the Orthodox parties, are against the court. The right-wing parties are against the ruling of the court regarding the occupied territories. They want more control over the occupied territories to annex it. And the religious parties are not happy with the decision of the court that they should also recruit to the army and have the same share. So that's how the coalition of interest about Bibi Netanyahu. Now, what happens, apropos populism, then many Israelis went to the streets to demonstrate against that, and that's already in 18 weeks there are demonstrations. There is a rift in the army, there is a rift in the economic situation in Israel, and now the solution right now is to suspend the legislation and try to find a agreement between the two, the coalition and the opposition representatives. Remain to be seen whether that will not succeed, and then we will see how it goes on.
Thank you
with
very
Bibi
much.
Netanyahu as the leader in the middle.
We better stop you there, Iris. We're running very, very interesting case study, which we'll come back to. All right, while you're gathering your thoughts together for an animated discussion, let me just raise a couple of points that came out of the presentation. So, Fui and Bogdan, one of the common themes in your talks, I think, was this relationship between leadership on the one hand and other institutions on the other hand. So this seems to be a rather complex and difficult relationship. So as we saw, it's typical of this plebiscitary approach that the key relationship is between the people and the leader, or at least some segments of the people and the leader. And it seems to follow from that either one or two things happen. The leaders there then try to, in effect, take over the institutions, and I think Iris has just given us a very clear account of that. The Israeli government attempting to take over the courts because the courts are relatively independent and therefore cannot be tolerated. So that seems to be one of the themes running through this, that the leader not only has the support of the people, which of course is a necessary condition, but the leader then naturally, if you like, tries to reduce the independence of institutions. I'd like to just take up that theme a bit more. How does the leader, first of all, let me just ask, how does a leader, in a sense, appropriate institutions or take them under his or her control? We've just heard how that happened in Israel. What about some other cases? So, Fui, would you want to comment on that? Where's Fui?
Okay.
Have you gone home? No, oh, there
Yeah,
you are.
no, well, I'm at home actually. But
It's tea time, but
no, I muted myself while the others were speaking. Denis, you raised quite, sort of an important and complex sort of question. I was actually, when Bogdan was speaking in particular, thinking of the issue of how a leader who may actually set out genuinely in a sort of symbiotic relationship with a mass movement can end up, as it were, co-opting that movement and becoming, as you say, the authoritarian ruler. I remember reading years ago about Juan Perón in Argentina. And I mean, he started off clearly mobilizing unions, in other words, people who were disadvantaged, and they invested in him yearnings, hopes. And he seems to have been effective at some point in achieving social improvement for the followers. But I mean, I saw a piece in which he was describing to intimate friends what it took to be a political leader. And I mean, memorably, he asked this friend, "Do you want to see my politician smile?" And he produces a set of false teeth. Sort of that's the mechanism. I mean, that's obviously a little technique. But I think the fundamental question, I mean, what struck me when I was listening to Bogdan was the possibility actually of, the mass movement being co-opted and exhausted at some point, and therefore ceasing to be a vehicle for pressuring or constraining the leader and the leader's activities. But as I think both Vlad and Bogdan said, getting into a situation of docility of the people. I mean, I don't think there's any constitution that can deal with that problem. This is an extra constitutional social situation, which colors the way that constitutions get implemented and effected.
Okay, that's very interesting. Bogdan, I'd like to bring you in at this point. Can you either take up one or two of the points that Fui has raised, or perhaps develop a little bit your own argument about the relationship between leaders and other institutions, such as the courts, but not only the courts, all the machinery of government, from the parliament to the administrative agencies. Would you like to say a little bit more about that, Bogdan?
Yes, Denis, thank you. But I think that's much more of a question for Vlad than for me. But I'll try to answer it in my own, terms. So my terms are the following, and it's a Schmittist point, not a Schmittian, but a Schmittist point that I'm making. Liberalism and democracy are not the same thing. They're opposed to one another. They can be reconciled, but they can be reconciled under certain conditions. You have to have some kind of social mobility. You have to have a certain degree of redistribution of wealth. My point is different than an institution, because you can have courts that are independent and rights that are well protected without democracy. One can have that without democracy. You don't need universal franchise for a reasonable degree of rights protection mechanism, a certain degree of lawfulness. You don't need that. You certainly don't need universal suffrage. But if you have it, it's not easy to reconcile with the institutions of liberalism, of liberal constitutionalism. So my point, my institutions are social economic. When you no longer have labor unions that function, you no longer have a press that is diverse and independent enough, you no longer have party machineries that are recognizable. When you don't have the Trente Glorieuses, so the period, the zenith of the reconciliation was, and this is not, this argument was made in a better form by Michael Wilkinson, for example, in his recent book on authoritarian liberalism, I think the title is.
Okay, well, let's just get, thanks, Bog. Let's go to Vlad. Vlad, we haven't got a lot of time. Vlad, do you want a quick comment, just a quick comment?
I mean, I will say that, I think that Fui's question, is there anything that constitutions or institutional structures can do when confronted with this amount of combination of charisma, this combination of extraordinary attraction? It's a fundamental question, and it's a profoundly difficult question. And if you look in history, you will see that what oftentimes happens is that the institutions of the state take the shape of the leader. Whether that leader is, De Gaulle in France, whether it is, Erdogan, it's an interesting example, the Turkish example, where depending on where the leader happens to find himself, whether in the position of the president or in the position of the prime minister, the state takes the shape, adapts itself to where the leader is. This didn't happen in Russia, by the way, because when Putin was prime minister, because he had to get out of the office for a little bit of the presidency, he was very bored with the position. He just wasn't doing much. People weren't even sure that he was going to return because he was, he was lazy. He was a lazy prime minister, and then he returned with a vengeance. But oftentimes this is what happens. And then this is a fundamental question: can institutions, can the state do anything? And and in one way, you would say that, well, it can provide bumps in the road, right? It can slow things down. It can't prevent these developments, but it can slow them down. And buying time can make a huge difference to these projects of undoing the constitutional state.
Thanks for that, Vlad. If one looks historically at this issue, and we go back to monarchical rule, or what I like to call princely rule in the kind of Machiavellian sense, the idea that institutions were separate from the leader were unheard of. That would be treason. That would be, even in the 17th century, at the time of the Putney Debates, the original Putney Debates, the courts were the king's courts, and indeed, symbolically, they still are. But in the 17th century, that really meant they were the king's courts, and the courts did what the king wanted them to do. And I just use that example. Of course, some exceptions, and in England, certainly the courts gradually tried to achieve an element of independence and autonomy, but it was taken for granted in early constitutional thought, in Europe at least, that somehow the prince was in charge of the whole show. And indeed, that was part of the prince's power, that he or she controlled the organs, the institutions of government. The idea of independence of the leader is a relatively new idea. And I think it is, for that reason, it is bound to be a very rocky relationship, very uncertain. And I think various of the speakers have brought this out very well today. Now, let me just give you the opportunity. We've only got a few minutes, and I do have a question that's come up from the audience, a couple of questions perhaps. So let's see. Iris, is there a question you'd like to put to the other panelists?
There's no specific question, but I just wanted to flag out that there is a lot undercurrent discussion here is about populist democracy and liberal democracy. And again, in Israel, Bibi Netanyahu says we represent the populist democracy, and the court, for example, is a liberal court, but it doesn't represent really what the people really want, and we know better. They also go over to overcome also the elections laws and the media and the academia, so every pocket which can resist them. But it's a big question of how to deal with the populist democracy vis-a-vis this liberal, or how much, as Bogdan said before.
Well, others like to comment on Iris's point. Fui?
Denis, I wonder whether we can't, I don't mind commenting, but I feel that we're constraining the opportunity for the audience. So perhaps if we have, a couple of questions from the audience, we can see.
Okay. Well, okay, we'll just go to the audience in a minute. Anyone like to just comment on that point of Iris's, though, which I think is very, very important here? Vlad, you must have a view about that.
I do have a view about that.
A quick view.
A quick view about that. I mean, I think that what's interesting about what is happening in Israel, and to really frame it use the framework that you have offered, Iris, is that to a significant extent you essentially have representatives of the people who are, in essence, trying to change the form of government. And so they are, in that sense, they are going beyond their mandate. Their mandate has never been an alteration of the form of government without any kind of direct appeal to the sovereign people. And so the problem with Israel is that, as you mentioned, there are, you feel that you're on your own, right? You do not have any kind of supranational norms. The court is under attack. And so if you could find a constitutional doctrine that would immunize the choice of the form of government from impermissible change by people's representatives as opposed to the people themselves, then that might be helpful. And my sense is that that's precisely what the Supreme Court of Israel is going to do when the laws that are now being discussed in Parliament will be presented to it and will have to rule on their constitutional validity. Because that moment will come, right? If these laws get enacted, the Supreme Court of Israel will have the opportunity to decide if they are constitutional or not. And, that will be the moment of true explosion.
Good. Okay, well, thanks for that, Vlad. I want to go to the one, we've only got a few questions. I just pick one and get your quick reactions to it but according to this, here's the question. While everyone seems to be scared of the power of Community Party in China, I don't know whether that's meant to be Communist Party in China, I wonder how you would view the correlation in the United Kingdom and the huge gap between the royal family and on-strike commons in the United Kingdom. Well, let's have a shot. Fui, you seem to have something to say about that, I'm quite sure.
Well, no, I'm puzzled. I'm not quite sure I understand the thrust of the question.
You can interpret it in your own way.
I know that there are reasons to focus on the extent of, let's say, the material wealth of the monarchy and its and the influence that it perhaps has through that material wealth and the ceremonial positions. I'm not sure that in constitutional terms there is a basis for comparing that with the Communist Party of China and its influence. But I feel that perhaps the questioner if they had more opportunity, would develop their point more.
Iris, quick comment?
I don't have anything to comment about that specifically. So.
Okay. Any Bogdan, do you want a quick comment on the royal family and the Communist Party in China?
Well, it's interesting. I just reread The Leopard and Lampedusa.
Oh, yes.
There was a debate between the higher nobility, between the prince and the relative of his, and says, well, we fight for the king, for the Bourbon king, against the what was the dynasty reigning in the peninsula? The Piedmontese, whatever. No? And why do you fight for the king? And the answer was, well, because they represent order and they're defenders of the faith and they represent property and they are against the sect. The Freemasons were the sect and the liberals, of course. And then the answer by the Prince of Salina is, well, but the problem is I know this king and I know the one before him, and there weren't much to begin with. Right. And so the point, I suppose, what the question asks is how do you justify that extravagant pomp and whatnot? Well, you justify it for as long as you believe that the institution is legitimate. And the only reason why you believe that is that you believe that the king is ordained by God. No, it's written on your coins, DG. Yes. As long as you believe that Charles III has been anointed on the backdrop of Handel's music by God himself, no, then you can believe in the perpetuation of the privileges of the monarch. Don't, you'll deserve it for reasons.
Yes, I'd recommend everybody to read The Leopard, yes. I have one question. We're coming towards the end of our time, but I want to persist with one or 2 points here. So the relationship between the prince or the leader, the elite, or however you like to express it, and equality. And I think this came out in a number of comments from the panel, that there is this tension between, if you like, leadership, particularly in the plebiscitary sense of leadership, on the one hand, and equality on the other hand. I think, Bogdan, you started this idea, but others perhaps have reflected it. What is at the bottom of that? Vlad, do you have a view about that, this relationship between the leader and the equality? I think Bogdan made it sound as if there was some incompatibility between them.
I will let Bogdan say a few words on.
All right, thanks. Well, Bogdan, you're in the chair now. You're in the hot spot. What did you have in mind there?
There's no incompatibility really, but you cannot function together as a society unless there is some kind of harmony. And if you don't ensure that harmony in social democratic terms, then that harmony will be offered by populists on more evil terms, ethnic homogeneity, for example. So ideally, one should ensure that in social democratic frameworks, social mobility.
Yes, it's interesting you bring in harmony there. Would you just like to expand a little bit on what you mean by harmony?
To believe that there is a social ladder, to believe that differences in wealth and class can be superseded. It's a fiction that is always a fiction, but the fiction has, just like with the monarchy, really. Just like you believe or do not believe that King Charles is DG Dei Gratia Carolus Rex, so you have to believe that the system is fair. Now, if you don't believe that it's fair, then the system will turn to pathological forms. That's my point.
If I can jump,
maybe someone else.
Can I shortly jump in?
Go ahead, Iris, please.
So I think what Bogdan is saying is also reflected in Israel. For example, the criticism about the court is that it was not liberal enough in the sense of making this equality work. So the Mizrahi Jews, the one who is coming from Middle East and Middle Eastern and North Africa countries, felt that they are discriminated and are not underrepresented in Israel. The Palestinian Arabs felt that they are not protected enough by the court. So liberals will need to think about it for the future, because the democracy we dream about was not a good democracy, as a matter of fact. There is a lot of criticism about the democracy we used to be. So now we are deteriorating, but it's not an ideal democracy even then.
Right. Thank you, Iris. So I think we've come to the point where I'm going to call for last comments. So we'll just go around the group. One last comment, and remember what we're talking about, the idea of leadership and democracy. So if you were to come away with one particular point from today's discussion, and against the backdrop of Richard's lecture, what would it be? What would be the one point you'd carry away? Irish, what would be your point?
So I think the role of leaders is very important, and the democratic crisis is very much entangled with the specific leader which makes the crisis go on. And therefore, I think we really need to think of how to temper this leadership and embed it in better institutions.
And what would be the solution? What would be a quick solution to embedding
I knew that. I knew that to the others.
That's true. All right.
Well,
a good way of putting it. At least Ira says isolation.
I think one good reason is a good way to go is about setting red lines that below that we cannot drop, and there will be institutions which will control that we don't fall below this certain red lines, as was Vlad saying.
Okay, thank you, Iris. Vlad, what's the one point you take away on this issue of leadership and democracy?
I take away a tremendous extent to which that relationship is unsettled, to which things are again up in the air, to which we continue to feel, we don't have the answers. Things are fluid to an extent far greater than we, I think, imagined they were going to be.
Yeah.
And so, that of course creates a great opportunity to rethink some of these relationships, but also, is a moment of risk.
Yes, that's an interesting point, Vlad. I always feel that in the post-Second World War Europe, and more generally, there was a sense of this is the norm. We've now achieved a certain kind of stability, a certain moderation, etc. It didn't last very long. That's the trouble. It didn't seem to last very long. And I think after the shock of the post-war had passed, we're back to normal. And we're back to normal in the sense that all these issues are really at the front of the queue again. But nevertheless, Bogdan, last point from you. What do you take away today?
I will take away what I brought in. As all of us do. No, really.
How would you express that point in one sentence?
No, because it was echoed by comments, my colleagues, panelists, you, Denis. So I will take away a better version of what I brought in. But what perplexes me and what will keep me occupied is the way in which central models are not central anymore. Right. Because there used to be a divide between the periphery and the core, and you looked up to countries in the core. So
very good point, Bogdan.
When my teaching and parental duties will allow me, I will work out the implications of that.
Okay. No, well, I think that's a very good point to end on. And Fui, you as the elder statesman, have the final word.
Well, I think I agree with Vlad about the unsettled state of the, I suppose, reflections on what the essential democratic norms and institutional arrangements are. I also feel that perhaps it's too ambitious to be seeking designs at the level of constitutional arrangements, institutions, and so on, with insufficient regard to the social situations, social movements, the challenges that those pose, and the contextualization that they require for organizing governmental arrangements and the expectations we have of them over time.
Thank you. Well, I think despite your modesty, each of you has come up with a very nice point to go away with and to bear in mind, a point which requires further consideration, further study and discussion. So I'd like to end by thanking you most warmly for your preparation, your participation, your good humor in the face of adversity, and generally speaking, for a very enlightening discussion. Thank you very much.